Good morning. We are here for another podcast. We're in season 2, episode 2, with Paul Hughes and Trista.
2-2.
Can you give us the date and a little bit of?
Sure.
We heard some news this
We
morning.
did hear some news. So, I would say happy Friday, but I'm just going to say it's Friday, January 21st. And so today we're going to be talking about music and its influence and power over like community and getting people together. But we heard that Meatloaf died today, so
Yeah. So when you go back and look at this,
Yeah.
we're gonna start out with a bummer.
yeah. Sorry, womp womp.
Big iconic person in the industry, and I know a lot of people. Tom came in, Crystal's husband
Yeah.
came in, and
Yeah.
he was totally destroyed.
Right.
And
right.
so that just plays into the point that we're trying to make. Music is important, and the people that make music, and I think the kids. I mean, do you remember whenever Kurt Cobain died? The effect on society that had was huge.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, anyways,
So,
without
yeah.
further ado,
So R.I.P.
our
Meatloaf.
man Paul Hughes, when we get back after this intro, is going to talk a little bit about music and society and how that trickles down into our local context and even the mental health of our kids and so on and so forth. Sound good to you?
Yep.
All right.
Our mission is to promote strategies and policies which ensure improved health for all citizens of Nowata County.
So,
We're back.
Trista and I were out on a walk the other day, and we came back down the alley, and who's pointing at us? It's Paul Hughes.
It's Paul.
And we were back in the back of his shop, and we went in, and of course we sat and talked for 45 minutes out in the freezing cold and came up with an idea about doing a podcast about music and how that is influential to not only society but our community. And we've kind of talked about this idea of this podcast evolving a little bit more and having maybe two different series. One to highlight individual stories, like season 2, episode 1, the previous one was Kevin's story, and he was telling his story about his life. And then the other idea was something to do, someplace to go, and someone to do it with. Concept about events in Nowata. What can you do to get involved? Not everybody is an athlete. Not everybody is a musician. Not everybody's a hunter or whatever. But there are a lot of things that people may not realize to do in Nowata. And Paul suggested we do a podcast on music and how that influences people. And of course, I can go on for days about my experience working with youth and how a lot of them use music as a coping mechanism. And so here he is. We're going to talk about it.
All right.
Yeah.
So take us away, Paul.
Well, you play an instrument. You play an instrument, right?
I have an
I play
instrument
an
or two.
instrument, right?
Yep.
I look pretty cool holding it.
And it doesn't matter on what level you have your instrument. Musical instrument, playing a musical instrument, and even sometimes just listening to music, depending on how far you get into it, is one of the only things, in fact, at some points, is the only thing that uses your entire brain all at the same time. So it came all the way up until 2014 for Australia and Liverpool and some of these areas around the globe to put in a study to find out the impact on intelligence in youngsters growing up with music as opposed to not. Because music always takes, especially this day and age, takes a backseat in education to a lot of other things.
Like you're talking like actual like music education, not just like listening to
Right.
music, but yeah.
But actually playing and comprehending and
Yes.
finding out all the ins and outs of everything. In the early 60s, they revamped some of the educational system and they removed music appreciation programs from the curriculum. And Frank Zappa said that he traces everything back from corporate control back to that. And he was somewhat of a conspiracy theorist and possibly even true, but he said it was done at the request of the commercial machine. A lot of people during those times think that top 40 is actually what ruined the music industry. And so everybody went to the FM stations in the 1970s And it was great because you could listen to an entire album commercial free, and you would listen to things that you wouldn't hear on the top 40.
I
And-
would kind of agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some top 40s I'm like, oh, that's a good song, but
Yeah.
not
Right.
all of them.
Yeah.
Well,
agree.
they used to call it payola back in the day, because if you had a band and you were a good band, you could take it to some of these regional famous disc jockeys, and you could slip them $200. And even that's really not right to say, because you would pay them $200 to put your record on the air. Now, if your record was terrible, you weren't going to get it on the air. So it had to have certain aspects of not necessarily a hit record, but it had to be entertaining anyway. And that came down to the opinion of the disc jockey. And in those days, 1950s, early 1960s, the local DJs were kind of the superstars on the radio. You could get your song on the radio, and people started to call up, yeah, play this song again, play this song again. Maybe you get a record contract, maybe you don't. So the industry saw that as a threat, and they began congressional hearings in the Senate, and they brought these DJs in, Dick Clark, Alan Freed, if you're familiar with any of those names, and they said, is it true that you take payola? Because by calling it payola, it gave it a negative connotation of, oh,
Like a
you shouldn't be
mafia-based
doing this. And poor Alan Freed in front of the Senate said, do I take money to put things on the radio? Yes, I do. You guys take payola, right?
To a bunch of senators and congressmen.
Right. It became obviously fairly quiet in the chamber at that point. And so that changed a lot of the face of the radio. What it really still comes down to is that there are only 12 notes. And it's incredible that you go back to the origin of music, which was basically people banging on trees and rocks and vegetables and
Gourds.
catgut strings and
Yeah.
things like that, which would start it out, and they would say, well, this is really not music, but that's where music originated. So you have your timing, and you have notes, which took a long time to really develop into our scale. Eastern scale has 5 notes. Our Western music has 12 notes. It's not that the Eastern scales can't find the other notes, but that's what their music consists of. At one point in the 1970s, they were coming out with a quarter note scaled guitar. So then instead of half steps all the way up, you could actually have quarter. And they built it, they messed around with it, and decided that it really wasn't music. So what a person now, everything has become so diversified, because you have the classic rock, you have the 50s rock, you have big band, you have classical music, you have all these different genres of music. And now it comes down to what's good is just nothing but opinion. And everybody is competing so heavily to try and get their music out in front of everybody. So things back in the 60s and the day where you had these giant music festivals, you can cue up number 2 photograph. This would be Woodstock in 1969, and 400,000 people. So that had not only a social impact, but it also had an environmental impact as well.
Obviously.
It took a lot of gasoline to get to the festival, obviously.
Economic impact.
Yeah, economic impact. People ran over the fences. No one paid to get in. They finally ended up having to have the festival to be free.
Nobody. I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody paid to get in. Oh my gosh.
It just got to be ridiculous. And so they still had to pay the bands, and the only thing that broke them even was the release of the film. In the original movie of Woodstock, they couldn't get song rights, and record studios were fighting over rights and one thing or another. So there were a lot of people that were completely left out of the album and the movie. Creedence Clearwater was there.
Oh, I love Creedence.
You know, Janis Joplin was there. She didn't get in on any of that. So, it becomes a fight over the money. So, if you'll cue up photograph number 2, you can see the environmental impact in the aftermath of Woodstock.
Looks like a war scene.
Yeah, it does. It really does.
So they all
You could have very
gathered and-
easily said this was like the end of World War II, because that's like a British flag, right?
Right.
I don't know if I've ever seen one with the stripes, but anyways, sorry, go ahead.
So there's the environmental impact. Today, environmental impact is where you download music, so you're not buying these vinyl discs, which is, got a carbon footprint. So do CDs, and those are basically obsolete at this point. So we've done away with a lot of that. People that are still putting out CDs are now using paper cartons. And obviously, with the download, you're just using your computer or your iPhone, and you can download whatever music you want. So it's taken that way down. On a social impact, it's had kind of an adverse effect because, especially in the last couple of years with the pandemic that's been going on, people have not been able to get out and or are reluctant to get out or refuse to get out for whichever the reason it is. They don't want to get out and get in large crowds. You look at Woodstock in 1969. There was actually a flu pandemic that was going on in 1969, although that was in August, and by the time August came along, no one cared. So on the reverse part of that, everyone sat home with nothing to do, so they've all got online, and everybody's bought a guitar. Guitar sales went through the roof.
Yep.
So
There were a lot of things during the pandemic that were like that. There was a whole list of
There's like bicycle shortage. or
Yeah,
something
yeah,
like that.
yeah.
Something totally.
people like
Yeah.
just super indulged in their hobbies, which hey, I was thinking about that social impact whenever it all started, because I was thinking, how do I capitalize on this? And there was a deal about number one. Do you know what the number one thing? I think we talked about this. Number one thing that was like skyrocketed was Tupperware. Like if you had bought stock in Tupperware right before the pandemic, then stock like completely quadrupled, a million times over. So you would have been rich if you'd have bought.
Fascinating.
I would have never known that, but I knew that something huge like that would have an impact. Social impact. Let me take it back. Do you, just a point to make, and we can talk about whenever we start wrapping up. But does music more or less have roots in, I guess, what are the words I'm looking for, like rebellion or because
It's kind
like the hippie movement was
it gives people a way to
it gives them a way to express themselves.
fight
Right.
the man or
To-
whatever.
yeah, that's what I'm. That's
Yeah.
what
Well,
I'm
there
going.
were
with.
a
Yeah.
lot of protest songs. There were a lot of songs that are written about love songs. It's an emotional driven.
Yeah.
Music is emotionally driven.
Evoking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You've got happy music. You have sad music. You have music about death. You have music about. There were a lot of protest songs.
And this is where the mental health kind of comes in, because we talk about, no one has got things to do, but we don't have things like bowling alleys and movie
Yeah.
theaters. We have parks. We have music instructors. We have a bunch of people that teach music.
And people want to look for something socially that I'm not the only one that thinks this way. So this is a popular song with me.
Right.
And, sometimes commercializing that takes away the personalization as well.
I've had two kids when I was a youth counselor, youth director at the churches. I had two kids literally come up to me and tell me that My Chemical Romance saved their life because they had had some suicidal thoughts. And My Chemical Romance, that was a lot of, I don't know a lot about their music, but it was a lot about struggling with depression and cutting and all this kind of stuff. So the point that I will kind of wrap up later is the kids that maybe don't feel like they have things to do because maybe they're not an athlete or maybe they're not in the school band, which hopefully if they're musically inclined or interested, hopefully they do go join Miss Prince and Mr. Bates and be a part of their music bands and choirs and stuff like that. But again, talking about tying things back into what our kids could do, we're not just here promoting Paul as a guitar teacher.
Right.
And if they want to, they need to know that Paul's available if that's what they want to do. But we also have Miss Tallman teaches piano. Do you know anybody else that teaches music that if these kids were watching or somebody, some grandmas or somebody was watching, they say, oh, you need to go talk to Paul. You need to go talk to Miss, because you were talking about putting Henry in piano lessons.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. He's been asking.
And sometimes we run into a lot of things with the parents that are going to teach their kids. I think I talked to you
Yeah.
about that
right.
too.
Oh, yeah.
that-
This is where the idea came
He doesn't
from.
want to learn from me. There's
Right.
no way.
and sometimes it just comes across to the parent as well. He just doesn't want to do this,
It sounds
and-
like go do the dishes.
right.
Right.
So when
Right.
when we had kids growing up, I knew my daughter didn't like green beans, so you would always give her a choice. What do you want for dinner tonight? You want peas? Or do you want green beans? Or do you want carrots? Or do you want green beans? Well, I already knew she wasn't going to pick the green beans, but she was happy to pick the lesser of the
Yeah.
two evils,
Right.
you know.
Right.
So that was her first introduction to elections as well. but but that works. That works well as far as musical instruments. Sometimes you have to you have to watch what your kid per age is going to listen to. But give them a variety of things and let them decide what it is that they like. Sometimes if the parent tries to teach the kid, it becomes take out the trash, pick up the living room, pick up your room, put your things away, play a G chord, play a C chord. And it's all coming from the
Right.
same don't tell me what to do mouth, you know.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I always think about the family ties with music, and I know there are a lot of musical families in this area. I grew up in a fairly musical family, and it strengthens families.
Oh, absolutely.
Because I think about
That's a great point. I didn't
when
think of it that way. Yeah.
when I grew up. Oh golly, how old was I when I started taking piano lessons and organ lessons? I actually started on a Hammond B3 organ, and it was an organ that my uncle played. So when he, grew up, got out of my grandma and grandpa's house, my grandma and grandpa gave my mom and dad that organ, and that's what I learned on, was the same organ my uncle played. And then of course I moved over to piano. But I think about all the stories you hear. Somebody has their granddaddy's guitar.
Oh, yeah.
And like all the stories and the memories from that.
The legacy
and,
that you can create. with it,
yeah, and so like it's a definite it strengthens families. It gets that family unit tighter. You've got something there that everybody has in common that they can share and you can pass down to generations. And I think that is what ends up trickling out into the community.
Yeah.
Are those
Speaking of
Because-
that legacy thing, sorry, Paul. That legacy thing, was it a year ago maybe that Trista came into your store and that Hammond was sitting there and she's like, oh, just drooling all over it.
Well, I mean, so my dream job when I was little, and maybe I have yet to fulfill that dream, is to play the organ at Wrigley Field.
Oh, that'd be
I
cool.
want to be the organist at the ballpark.
That's a cool bucket list. That's cool.
It's pretty
Yeah.
cool, yeah. So, like, whenever I see, like, a Hammond B3 or something like that, I'm always like, whoa, that's awesome.
Another
That'd be so cool.
element that I think is a good time to talk about real quickly is you went into town, right? Your mom was kind of a organizer, and you started playing some music, and you learned how to play the mandolin and stuff with a group of people. And Paul's got a group of jammers.
Yeah, that was another thing. I didn't learn how to play mandolin until I was like in college, or it was like right after high school. I'm trying to think. Anyway, a friend of mine in high school, he played the mandolin, and I ended up wanting a mandolin, and my dad got me one for Christmas. And so my friend was teaching me how to play, but he said, there's this group in town. They meet on the courthouse steps like every Tuesday evening, whatever. And they're all these old pickers. That's all they were. And it was the best way to learn. But I also got to.
That's how I learned. Paul pointed
I got
that
to
out. That's
meet
my learning
people
style.
Who were, I mean, that was like a multi-generational group, and it was so awesome to learn from them. And while, of course, I sat next to the mandolin pickers, I still learned stuff from the fiddle player. I still learned stuff from the upright bass. But so anyway,
That's
yeah,
one of the best environments to learn
Just
in.
sitting
Just throw it out
around
there
and-
and watch everybody else play and go, this works with this
but
and this works with
it kept
that.
me out of trouble.
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, it
That's
kept me
right.
out of trouble. It was cheap. All I had to do was drive into town to do it.
Could you
know?
imagine if in the summertime somebody organized, Paul, like at Spike's Park, and then just have a bunch of acoustic instruments,
Just a
people
community
sitting in there, and
picking
just
group.
what if people did that during our garden market? That'd be so
had
cool.
that.
We could
Yeah,
listen
we're
to you
talking
guys.
about doing that now.
We could let you guys over at
With our-
Spike's Park.
I mean,
Or
what about
Friday
like
Oh,
open,
just your Friday night.
open mic night? We've got a lot of people that do that at
Yep.
open mic night.
That's
Yeah.
kind of where that concept came from as
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
Yeah. So
So, anyways, I cut you off a while ago. I'm
That's all
sorry.
right.
I just knew that she had a great story that really tied into
well,
that community.
I'll say this too. I learned music at an early age. So it's easy for me, even if I haven't seen a piece, and I mean everybody can relate to that who started early. You can sit down and you can sight read and you can kind of just hammer it out right there.
Right.
But I think about my mom. When I was little, my mom and dad didn't have the extra money, so it was just my brother and I that learned how to play. It wasn't until later on, after my brother and I graduated and moved out of the house, my mom's like, I want to take piano lessons.
No.
So my mom learned how to start playing piano at the age of like 60 or so, or 55 or 60, I don't remember. And so it's really hard for her,
Yeah.
but she's she's probably playing like, I don't even know, probably the same level that I was playing at when I was like 12, and she gets really
It's never
embarrassed
too
by
late.
that.
Never
but
too late.
I feel like that keeps her doing something. Of course, it's great for her brain,
Sure.
know.
And that's if you learn the motor skills from when you're very young, 4, 5,
Yeah.
6 years old, you never lose those things.
No.
They say you cannot learn perfect pitch, and by perfect pitch, you can hear any tone, any place, and you know whether it's a C sharp or if it's a B flat or whatever
Yeah.
note that is. A funny story was Leon Russell was 4 years old when he started to take classical piano lessons. And it was really for therapy because he had cerebral palsy from a birth injury. And so it was therapy. He had climbed up on the piano stool and played a song he heard in church and transposed it to his left hand because that worked better. So they got him into classical lessons. He had perfect pitch, but the piano that they got was an old piano. And so the piano tuner told him, well, if we tune this a half a pitch lower, it'll stay in tune better. So he said, my perfect pitch is a half a step off. So he said he had to learn to compensate for that. And it's always intrigued me, somebody that has learned classical to start out with, and then they come back in this, when you start playing rock and roll, the influence, you could hear his influence by Chopin and the way that he would run different scales and the big heavy chords and things like that. Then he also had a big influence from a lot of the church music, which he put a lot of choir into the back of his music as well.
So what I'm hearing is this is all the more reason to join your school band, your school choir, or go get lessons from Paul or Miss Tallman or whoever else does.
Every time I see like the No Water Marching Band, they've got a few more people, and they get bigger and bigger and better and better, and you get to see all the cool stuff they
because
win
you'll
at the competitions and stuff.
You'll use music your entire life. Think about it. If you go to a movie and you watched a movie and there was no music in the background, it's pretty hard to guide somebody's emotion through what you're trying to sell through this movie. So
even if you're a big heavy metal guy or something like that, you still need the basics.
Yep.
You need the solid foundation. Then go do your heavy metal afterwards. Get classically trained or get an education on it. In other words,
playing music, there are really 10 things. An instrument makes you smarter. The instrument doesn't make you smarter, but playing an instrument will make you smarter. Einstein said he could not imagine a life without playing music. He was a violinist. Yep.
Right,
And he also played piano, but he was pretty accomplished on the violin, and he learned to play at an early age, 6 years old.
there's a super strong connection between music and math specifically, right?
Yeah, everything is fifths and sixths, and goes right on up to all the numbers. Your social life will improve depending on what kind of level player you are, because I was in a band once and my social life actually declined because we weren't very good.
Was it a polka band?
Context. It was a polka band.
No, it wasn't a polka band, but as they say, a guy that showed up to for a New Year's Eve, and he walked in to find out where the band was going to set up. The guy says, a little stage right over here in the corner. He said, what do you play? He said, I play an accordion. And he said, well, where's your accordion? And he goes, well, I left it out in the car. And he goes, well, to be honest with you, this neighborhood is not that good. You probably shouldn't leave it out there. Sure enough, he went back out to the car, and someone had broke the back window out. They put 2 more accordions in there.
I knew it was going somewhere. I was just bracing myself.
It also relieves stress.
Absolutely.
Some people will sit with a guitar or a bass and just watch TV. When the Beatles met Elvis, they said they went over to his house, and Elvis was just sitting with the TV on or the record player, and he would just sit there and play these bass lines. Partly because he wasn't that fond of the Beatles, and partly is because that's what he did. And
didn't he suffer from major depression?
Oh yeah, it's funny. The
lot of
Beatles said
artists
one
do.
time, John Lennon said, I felt bad for Elvis because he said, we experienced this whole big fame and ride to the top all together, but he did it all by himself,
Yep.
And, it was a lot more difficult for him. It's something John Lennon always felt that he sold out. He said, we sold out. We put on suits and ties, and we weren't those guys. And we bowed in front of the cameras and played 20 minutes, and we ran off the stage, and our records went to the top, and we had, all the fame, all the money. And he said he'd never do it again. So
Isn't that
he
wild?
genuinely loved the music. And it depends on the person and how they can handle that. Paul McCartney, on the other hand, has an entirely different opinion about,
Yeah.
how they went through it. I think he weathered things much better. It just depends on the person. Music is a really tough industry. There's so much competition, and especially now because, like I said, with this pandemic and everybody bought guitars and they all sat home, and there's no telling what will come out of all this. But at the same time, it gets to be the old joke about what's the difference between a large pizza and a guitar player. A large pizza will feed a family of 4. Because there's so many. You go to Nashville and there's people on the street corner with a guitar case open up and people are throwing change in it. And there's no way that most people would hope to become that level of musician.
Yeah. I think a good piece of advice, even though we're highly encouraging those that might be interested in being a part of music, even if you don't play, if in a perfect world, if something like a jam session happens somewhere around town or open mic or whatever, go listen to it. I mean, that's almost as therapeutic for those that, like me. I don't have an actual natural music bone in my body, but I want it so bad I try. But I can have just as much fun sitting and listening to you guys jam. But I think one piece of advice is, if that kid's out there, if you want to pick up and be a musician, don't go into it with the attitude of, I'm going to be a rock star or I'm going to make a living. Do it because you love it. And if it happens, great. If not, then...
When you put together a band and you have 4 or 5 or 6 people in the band, it's really difficult because you have to get along on a social level. You can't have somebody in there that everybody hates. You can, and that doesn't last very long. You don't want somebody that's better than everybody else. They have a tendency to play over the top and walk all in, and it takes the fun out first. So that everybody has to be compatible. Then they have to agree on the type of music that they want to play. Their schedule has to be similar. And by the time you wrap it all up and figure out what does it take to make a band, when you turn on the radio, it's amazing that any sound even comes out. And then what classifies as music? I think I've got a sound clip number 2, and it just depends.
Oh. I love this jam.
So this is Yoko Ono and John Zorn on saxophone. So this is right, but they are. So John Zorn, he was an arranger. He is an arranger, and he's also a producer. And he wants to be the guy to color outside the lines. So they come up with this type of music. What kind of cracked me up a little bit about it is that there's always been this thing in commercial music that the song has to be between 2 and 3 minutes long. If it's too long, people won't play it. There's been a lot of examples of music that came along over the years, Stairway to Heaven and Hey Jude, and a lot of these long songs that give the DJ
American
a break
Pie.
as well. Yep. And
Dreamweaver.
but on that particular recording, it was exactly 3 minutes long. So even though they color outside the lines, I mean, who wants to listen to more than 3 minutes of that? Some people do. But they say this goes all the way back to when music was in its infancy. And they were just clanking on rocks. And I've heard rocks that maybe sounds better than that to me. But it becomes personal
Do they call
opinion.
that deconstructing?
Right. And then music also, it relieves stress, but it also brings out an emotion. There's a story in Tulsa at the Hissam Memorial Center, and they had, that was a center for a lot of kids that had a lot of physical and mental disabilities. So here comes Leon Russell again from California, decides to move back to Tulsa, and he wants to make
I know
this
this story.
right, and he wanted to make this commercial splash by going to the Hissa Memorial Center and playing for these kids. And so the more he thought about it, once he had committed, the more he thought about it, he said that, well, he got a little bit worried because some of these kids can't really control themselves in the emotion of the music and stuff. So he told everybody in the band, we got to have to play down, you know. And he did this strictly out of promoting himself, because in 1970, with long hair and a beard, it was much different than it is today, especially in Tulsa, to become accepted. So he wanted to do something for the community that would show that, you know, he's an okay guy. The entire thing really backfired on him, because he said he underestimated what it was going to do for him rather than what he was going to do for the kids. And he said by the time he was so moved, some of the people who worked there came up to him and said, some of these kids have not shown any response to anything in 6 years, and now they're in their chairs trying to dance. So he got so choked up by it, by the time the thing was getting ready to finish, all he could do was just speak the words. He couldn't even sing. And so, you know, it's heavily into emotion.
Didn't he keep lowering it and lowering it?
Yeah, he
because
kept
felt
pulling
like
it back and pulling it back, and until it just got to be where he just needed it to be over, because he was an emotional wreck over the whole thing. So there's a sound clip I think you started to play, and before you play that, there's a lot of emotions just in this short clip, and the actual song is about 6 minutes, and I think this is just maybe 45 seconds of that. But he had a particular voice that he used when he would use his stage voice, and it was kind of a satire from the old TV preachers from the 1960s. And he developed this way of talking, which to me is pretty humorous, and I think it was to him as well. Willie Nelson is introducing him, and so he's got that, but he talks about this letter that was given to him just before he got on stage. And then as he's talking about it and he starts to play, he gets choked himself. And then he starts to play the song that he had done 10 years earlier, which gave him the title of Master of Space and Time. And when the crowd hears what song it is, then they just, you know, erupt. They go nuts. And so you can play that. It's a lot of different
Thank you very much. God bless each and every one of you. You know, just before I came on the stage tonight, a letter was handed to me that it brought a realization to me that I want to share with you this evening. I've had the privilege of being out on tour with Willie Nelson for some weeks now. It brings to mind all the wonderful things that this man has accomplished. It's what this letter refers to. It's from this wonderful young lady that said she'd come to the concert, and her mother had come to the concert. Brave conditions of ill health, so she could come down here and see this man, Willie Nelson. I want to thank God for Willie Nelson tonight.
Who doesn't like Willie? His music may not be
Bless your
perfect, but
heart.
he's such a sweet human.
There's healing in music, folks. And I'd like to sing this old song of mine for Kathy Beninati. I've been so many places.
So that's, you know, it pulls out a lot of different emotion. Like I said, it relieves stress. Playing an instrument gives you a sense of achievement. You know, I never thought I could play that, and now you can, so you're off to the next thing. Your brother or sister never thought you could play that, and then they wish you couldn't play that. Monotony. It's something that's a puzzle to kids that have what they say is OCD. obsessive compulsive disorder. Music is extremely attractive, and you have to really be careful with kids like that because they'll take an instrument and they just don't put it down. They're running scales all the time and they're just eating it, and they become very good very fast. And then when they become bored with that, something takes its place. And unfortunately, a party will follow music because it's such a good time. So people will have a beer. People start making other things available to you as well. And that's why a lot of musicians have such a hard time with alcoholism and drug abuse. And
Wow,
and
I
these
never
type of
thought about it
things,
that way, but yeah, absolutely.
because that becomes the OCD. Now I've mastered everything I need to do musically, so now, this becomes the crutch. So that's one aspect that you kind of have to watch. If you're going to do it, run it as a business, and for people that want to make a living at this. There are a lot of other things that you can make a living at with music, not just playing the music. Playing music and becoming famous is just extremely difficult, especially in this day and age, the way that the industry is. But
You're more likely to be an NFL football player than you are to...
Right.
Yeah.
Or being the organist at the baseball game.
Yeah.
But you
Yeah.
probably have a fairly big chance because how many organists are there?
True dat.
There's
True dat.
only
Less and less every day.
Yeah.
There's only one Chicago Cubs organ, but
Who can play it?
I wouldn't
Yeah.
be surprised. They have a lottery that people will draw to see who gets to go up inside the Mackinac Bridge and go up to the top, and a certain amount of people. So maybe they should have a lottery. That's something you could get started.
They need a golden ticket.
Yeah, that's right. So it improves your patience, obviously, because it becomes motor skills, and to get something to motor skills, it's different time with different people. So you have to be careful. Don't compare yourself with, well, so-and-so learned this faster or somebody's better or whatever. It's about the enjoyment first. And for an example, I always tell students when they start, if you're ever around a 2-year-old kid and they call them the terrible twos and they throw temper tantrums and they're frustrated, they know the language already and they know what they want to say, but their mouth doesn't work. They don't have the vocabulary until they just get so frustrated, they just want to throw everything out in the street. So guitar playing's like that until you get the motor skills of this hand has to work with this hand has to be dead on behind the frets, and if it's guitar or whether it's piano. And if you make a mistake, it sticks out like a sore thumb. And so it becomes over and over and over until you begin not to think about it. Because if you look at somebody that John Hartford could tap dance and play the fiddle while he sang, and that's an incredible amount of motor skill that has to be committed to muscle memory because you can't think about all three things at the same time. So muscle memory has to take over at some point. And a good example, too, is on piano. One of the two hands has to have muscle memory. If you're playing an old boogie-woogie song with this bass line on here, you've got to commit that to muscle memory so that you can do the show-off hand that goes along with it. It'll increase your discipline. Some say it will increase your time management skills. That's something it never did for me. But maybe ADHD stands in the way of some of that too. It does make you more creative. There's something about...
Because it uses both hemispheres, right?
Right, yeah. Front, back, upside down, inside out. It uses the entire brain. It does make you more creative. I know that painting in years past, and if I had taken 3 or 4 years and I didn't paint and I came back to it, I was much better. Because the entire time that 3 or 4 years is going by, you're looking at other things. How does the shadow fall on this? You look at things a little bit differently. And so when you come back to it, it's like, wow, this is better yet. The same thing with music. If you take a few years off, now mechanically your hands have to catch back up to whatever you're playing.
Along those lines, you know how, like a lot of Alzheimer's patients, who obviously they played music or they listened to music or they sang in the church choir or whatever when they were younger. And then, of course, they're, disabled by this awful disease. But they can bring up the music they used to listen to, or they give them a guitar.
Glenn Campbell was a good example.
Glenn Campbell's a perfect example.
Yeah.
I know a lady in Chelsea who passed away a few years ago who was, she sang in their church choir, and that's what her husband would do. He would play all her songs for her, and she'd just sing right along and never forget a word, you know. But it's something about music that sticks in your head, even with something like that.
Yep.
What can't music do?
Well,
There are people that don't like music. Have you ever ran into them people?
Sure.
They're weird. I don't get it.
Everybody has their own.
Sorry, I'm just joking. If you don't like music, you're not watching this podcast. So.
And there was a music theater that was across the street for years, and I played in the house band there. And sometimes at halftime, people would come up and say, "You know, I don't really like drums," which we had a drummer all the time, obviously, and stuff. And I thought, well, you know, I don't do the hiring, but it just depends on if you're a kid growing up and you listen to a lot of bluegrass and they don't have a drummer. That's what you enjoy. My first set of drums was Tupperware. So maybe that's part of the reason why the stock went up so much.
Yeah.
I couldn't afford drums. They got the Tupperware.
You couldn't
out.
afford. You got rid of all your guitars and everything, so you bought all the Tupperware so you could at least make music.
And people don't realize how much really goes into to become a good musician. And so if there's a short little article that says what you think you're paying for when you hire a musician, someone to perform some music. And what you're actually paying for is somebody to perform the music, plus the equipment and the instruments, hours of rehearsal time, rehearsal space, transportation to and from the venue, the amount of money spent on lessons, training to become musicians that they are, promotion and website costs, the percentage that goes into income taxes, telephone and internet bills spent on organizing the performance and the rehearsals, any manager, agent, or other booking fees, which can become very heavy. Insurance, not to mention the payment also has to cover food, housing, bills, and all the other living expenses. So it's you get very little gratitude out of something like that.
As a photographer and cinematographer and videographer, I get
Right.
the same thing. I've helped book bands in the past, and they would go, "Would your band come in and play for $50?" I'm like, "You want a DJ? You want to hit play on a that's what you want. You don't want a band. You want a DJ for $50."
Sure.
Or not a DJ, but a computer that has music and
when
hit
DJs
play.
came
a
out,
playlist
and karaoke, when a lot of the clubs found out that the drunks were perfectly content to entertain themselves, then that cut into a lot of bands. I mean, why pay a band when these guys are just as happy to stand up there and make fools of themselves? And there's some genuinely talented people that go in and do karaoke as well.
My wife is fantastic. Every time we go into a place more than once, they remember her because she's just good.
Open mic night here in No Water. You have some people live music, some people will perform with tape music, and it's an entertainment. We always had to realize that regardless of what you wanted to play, you had to know your audience and play what they wanted to hear. And so I became a Western swing guitar player, which is something I never grew up listening to. My dad did, and a lot of hillbilly music, and my mom listened to classical, so I had whiplash music theory when I was a kid. But nonetheless, I found out in a big hurry that if the people come to hear you play Western swing and that's what you play, it was a lot of fun. Yeah. And I got a whole new respect for the mechanics of that type of music. Sometimes 2 chords for every beat, and it'll work you to death if you play it right. So it's tough to get into an industry. You can be a session player, you can play as an amateur, you can play hopefully as a professional, but then you can DJ, you can get into the radio music, you can get into the production end of things. You can be a song publisher, you can be a songwriter. There's a lot of things you can do in the music industry that you don't have to just be the Rock and Roll Hall of Famer. And on a local basis, I would say, they're saying as much as 65% better. Obviously, I didn't gain that, did I? It increases your mental fortitude, I guess, for lack of a better word, up to 65% if you learn music through school. And I think that's one of the shames that was taken from the curriculum was music appreciation. in that, it's been said that that's when, commercial Big Brother had taken over, and now we get to tell you, and it wasn't just through the music, but it was through, the clothing and the trends and the whole thing that they began to manipulate. Back at Woodstock in 1969, they all came together with a common purpose, and that was to have 3 days of fun and music, and that's exactly what they had. And then it rained, and they still had
And it
fun
became
and
iconic.
music.
Yeah, it's still.
Yeah.
So I would hope, I mean, with beautification, we're talking about music. Music is art. And then there's a lot of times that we have conversations. I say we, and some other we's. Talk about there's potential for a renaissance here in Nowata for art and music. We got the murals, we've got open mic night. I would love to see somebody spearhead some kind of jam session open to the community someplace. If I don't know if the Jubilee ever opened back up, or Paul's place is being remodeled. I mean, I don't know how much you want me to talk about that, but there's potential there, and there are tons of musicians. I don't want to start naming off some names, but there are a lot of musicians that started here in churches, and they're doing a bunch of other things. There's some bass players, and so I mean, man, if they just had a platform to go out. I love your story about going and sitting in the jam sessions back in Illinois, and because that is a lifelong thing that you carry with yourself, and it's something to do, someplace to go, and someone to do it with. That
You
is
never forget
family
those
friendly.
things. We have Friday night, anywhere from 4 to 8, 10 different musicians that come in locally, and we just throw songs out there and butcher as much as we can. I mean,
That's fun.
but there's
But you have a
something.
blast doing it.
Oh
man.
yeah, and there's something to be said about playing with a particular group of people. I play with Rob Reed and John McCracken and his son Kirk and some other guy, and I've played with that band for 6 years, and you have a certain camaraderie that you just don't really replace. I still remember the band that I played in Michigan. We had 5 people, and you still have that sense of belonging to that thing and having accomplished. Our big claim to fame is we got to open for 2 Marty Robbins
Really?
concerts in
That's
Saginaw,
cool.
Michigan.
Really? You never told me that, Paul.
And it's been downhill ever since. And it's a big thrill to stand up on the big stage in front of that many people and to be able to perform. And it's something that glues the people in your band together,
That's cool.
And you start to overlook your differences, and you have this common. And I thought when I came to Oklahoma, we'd get right back into music and go that direction. And it took a long time to lose most of my Yankee accent to be accepted. So,
Well, Nowata historically has been known as a football powerhouse, and there's a lot of guys out there that played football or played basketball, guys, gals. I know that the bands, the high school bands, are very tight knit. There's just a camaraderie whenever you spend so much time practicing, and lifting each other up or holding each other accountable. It is no different than being on a football team, basketball team, softball team, baseball team, in the actual band, choir, etc.
except one you're using your brain, and the other one you get your brains bashed out.
Right. But it's a lifelong thing. I played a little sports back in the day, and my body kind of hurts from it still yet to this day. But anyways, there's a lot of opportunity out there if if some organization or whoever would love to start having more conversation about creating some more. And Arrow and some other people have this arts, culture, humanities.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe that's
Yeah.
some place to start. Maybe that's where you go take ideas. There's a lot of us that would love to help facilitate these ideas. Anything that improves the environmental impact, that's important to us here at CAN. And there's things that we can help with, and there's things that we can't. We've got to stay within our boundaries and using our resources. But we want to see, we want to help create as many opportunities as we can for people to make Nowata a healthier, happier, more fun place to live and work and play. So, is there anything else in the wrap up?
I would just say you'll be able to use music the rest of your entire life.
Yep.
You know those kids that sit there and say, well, I'll never use this subject ever again. Well, the fact is, part of it is true. But music, you'll always use it.
Sure.
If you buy into it and you want to and you pursue it, you will use it in some way, shape, or fashion.
And it's always a skill you're going to have.
But we have quite a level of fame from somebody right here in Nowata County who's Big Al Downing.
That's right.
Not to trail off on
No, that's perfect.
We've got his
another
picture.
Because
entire thing,
someday,
but
I don't know
We've
if
got
we
his
can, if you
picture.
can really see. Oh, what am I pointing at? I can't tell there.
There's
But
a glare.
it's we hope to eventually pursue some conversation with some family members of his.
Yep.
So that's perfect. Yeah.
he's a man that lived just a few miles north of here, and he was piano player for Wanda Jackson's backup band, Bobby Poe and the Poe Cats. He had a #1 disco tune on the charts for 3 weeks in a row, which was #1 in the 1970s. He did country, did rock and roll. He was on Hee Haw, Pop Goes the Country. He toured in Austria, in Europe, and the guy had a phenomenal career. I think he had 13 albums, 23 singles, and he's right here from Nowata County, and barely a mention of this
And
guy.
we need to know more about this
We do.
guy.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a
We do.
local.
There's
He's
some good YouTube videos on him that he's just a phenomenal performer. I don't think I've seen a more charismatic guy anywhere.
that goes back into that whole, if we kind of split into series, you know, we could have a series on local people. I mean, I'd love to have Matt West. I don't mean to put him on the spot. I know he's a busy guy, but we could have some family members. We have friends that are Downings. I know some connections. Me and Misty might get on the horn and see if we can track some stuff down. Paul has some resources on the Downings, and but that could be a whole series of individuals from Nowata and their stories.
Yeah.
You know, and so anyways, we've had a
Cool.
long podcast, and I
Yeah.
will sit here and talk. Paul and I could keep going forever.
Oh,
but
I know.
we may
I
have
know.
to split this up, just so you know. But is there anything else that we need to talk about? We may throw it to our outro, and we'll
Yeah.
Play an instrument, get
get
smarter.
back to the computer and start typing documents.
Yep. Thanks for joining us, guys.
All right, take us to our outro, Misty. Thank you so much.